Madam President.
The senator from South Dakota.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today for the first time speaking in this chamber to discuss the future of our great nation. How truly fortunate we are to live in the greatest country in the world. We are protected by the best military that has ever existed, and that, in turn, allows us to live freely here at home, to focus on our God-given rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In my home state of South Dakota, we cherish these rights. We have the opportunity to make our dreams come true because we have these rights and because we have a common sense value system to guide us. When I was elected, I promised to bring South Dakota common sense to Washington and to work to solve problems for the good of every South Dakotan and every American. But unfortunately, Madam President, when I travel back home, I continue to hear from my fellow South Dakotans about the federal government infringing on these rights and values. You see, our great nation has been bogged down in recent years with what I believe is one of the greatest hindrances to job growth and economic productivity, and that is the overregulation of our citizens. Madam President, overregulation is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. It's an issue that affects every single one of us. But I believe it's a challenge that we can solve through cooperation and perseverance. It doesn't matter if you're talking about a doctor, a small business owner, a farmer, or a rancher. Overregulation has affected every single sector of our society. The regulatory burden on this country is nearly $2 trillion annually. $2 trillion. And this is in addition to the tax burden already placed on our American citizens. That regulatory burden is larger than Canada's entire economy. In fact, the cost to comply with federal regulations is larger than the entire GDP of all but only 8 other countries in the entire world. Even more staggering, just a few years ago, we surpassed 1 million federal regulations in America. 1 million federal regulations. Regulations are stifling economic growth and innovation and hurting the future of this country by crushing the can-do American spirit that founded our nation, settled the West, won 2 world wars, and put a man on the moon. And every year, more than 3,500 new federal regulations are added. This just does not make sense, and it certainly is not South Dakota common sense. What alarms me is not only the volume of regulations being thrust upon our citizens, but also the process for creating them. The purpose of Congress is to be the voice of the people when making laws. Unfortunately, the voice of the people in the rulemaking process has been cut out and replaced by unelected government bureaucrats who think they know better than the farmer or the scientist or the entrepreneur. Our founders recognized the need for making laws, granting the power to create laws to Congress and only Congress. They meant that process to be difficult so that our government would not overburden citizens and restrict their freedom that those founding fathers had just fought so hard to obtain. Through Congress, every citizen should have a voice. But unfortunately, Madam President, that is not what is happening today. Our founding fathers created 3 branches of government with checks and balances for each one. They could never have imagined that we would have a regulatory process in place today where unelected bureaucrats would both write and have the final approval of the rules and regulations under which our people must live. This regulatory regime, which is responsible for the 3,500 new rules each year, has essentially become a 4th branch of government and a de facto legislative body. The problem is exacerbated because these bureaucrats in Washington have this misperception that they know how to run our lives better than we do. While working as a business owner, a state legislator, as a governor, and now a United States Senator, I've seen just how detrimental this Washington knows best mentality is on the daily lives of South Dakotans and Americans. Many of my friends on both sides of the aisle have come to the Senate floor in recent weeks and months with some great ideas and legislation to limit or stop or repeal or remove some of the worst regulations currently on the books. I applaud them for these efforts, many of which I also support, and I look forward to working with the senior senator from South Dakota, my friend John Thune, as well as anyone who is willing to work with me to remove these burdens that are stunting American greatness and, well, bring a little South Dakota common sense back to our regulatory environment. The regulatory system in America has run amok. Too often, Madam President, burdensome, costly, and intrusive regulations are crafted by bureaucrats at the highest level of government, behind closed doors, with little input from everyday Americans who disproportionately feel the effects of these one-size-fits-all policies. It is regulation without representation, and it is wrong. The American people are being squeezed out, their voice falling on deaf ears in Washington. Small businesses which drive our economy and create the majority of jobs in America are especially hurt by overregulation because they too have to hire lawyers and employees to comply with these rules. This takes away capital that could be used to hire new production employees and expand their businesses. People in my home state of South Dakota feel victimized by their own federal government. It is keeping crops from getting to market, and it's keeping businesses from growing. The idea that unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats should be allowed to make sweeping rules and regulations with no recourse should be a concern to every American, regardless of political affiliation, because it impacts everyone. No party has a lock on the American dream, and American innovation doesn't have a party affiliation. From the stack of paperwork required to process a bank loan to the regulatory price of putting food on the table, the cost of federal regulations are ultimately passed down to each and every American. Without excessive regulation, imagine how much more money American families could have in their pockets to spend on what they want instead of what the government wants. If we cut our red tape, families can stop having to cut their budgets. The regulatory regime is a dark cloud over our entire economy. Now, Madam President, I'm not saying that there isn't a place for rules in our society. There are. Rules are meant to keep us safe and to promote the greater good. And I do believe that there are some good rules and regulations which are on the books today. The problem I have is with the bad rules that keep good people from going about their daily lives. Unfortunately, there are too many of these bad rules that are hindering our freedoms and stifling our growth. These are the regulations which we should have a process in place to re-examine. So today, Madam President, I come to the floor to discuss bipartisan legislation which we have already introduced to permanently end regulation without representation. It takes a giant leap forward in restoring the people's role in the rulemaking process. After all, if the American people don't like the laws that we make, they can vote us out. But they have no such power with unelected bureaucrats. They are stuck. You see, Madam President, the bipartisan legislation that we have introduced, Senate Concurrent Resolution 17, would create a joint select committee on regulatory reform whose purpose includes reviewing regulations currently on the books and proposing a new rules review process that includes the elected representatives of the American people. It's rooted in South Dakota common sense and the principles that have made this country great, making government work for Americans rather than against them. Madam President, this committee would make several recommendations to Congress to rebalance this broken regulatory scheme. First, the committee would be tasked with exploring options for Congress to review regulations written by agencies before they are enacted, providing much-needed oversight through the possibility of a permanent joint rules review committee. This would be tasked with reviewing rules with a cost of $50 million or more. This permanent joint rules review committee would have the ability to delay the imposition of these rules for not more than a year from the time the agency submits the rule for a review to enable Congress to act on the rule if they don't care for the rule. Second, the committee would examine an option for agencies to submit each regulation with a $50 million impact or more to the appropriate committees of Congress for review before the rule is enacted. And finally, the Joint Select Committee could recommend ways to reduce the financial burden regulations place on the economy, as well as sunsetting onerous and outdated ones. This Joint Select Committee would not be a permanent one, but it would be bipartisan, bicameral, and hold meaningful hearings so that a permanent solution to our overregulation problem can be properly addressed. This legislation also offers a starting point for the committee by requiring certain possible solutions to our regulatory problem to be considered. I firmly believe that regulations should be reviewed by elected officials, those who are accountable to the American people through the democratic process. This is not a new concept. It is not rocket science. It is a common practice at the state level. In fact, 41 of the 50 states, including my home state of South Dakota, have a rules review process to make sure that the executive branch is faithfully executing the laws that they seek to implement. It is worth repeating that regulations are estimated to cost $1.88 trillion annually in the United States. And that is above and beyond the tax burden which our citizens already share. That amounts to just under $5 billion every single day, and it just doesn't make sense. It's unfair to those who still believe and are working to achieve the American dream. Whether Americans are seeking to buy a car, take out a mortgage on a house, start a business, or see the doctor, regulations obstruct them. When I think of those who sacrificed everything so that our children and grandchildren could create their own version of the American dream, I think about the freedoms and liberties they fought so bravely to defend. They fought so that we could pursue life, liberty, and happiness, and trust that our government would not hinder these lifelong endeavors. It is not Washington that will continue to make this country great, but rather the collective spirit of individual Americans who want to work hard to be successful for their families and their communities. But they need the heavy hand of government to be lifted. Here in Washington, it is not our job to dictate how Americans run their lives, but to allow them to achieve their dreams, not make them into nightmares. The term Washington is broken is far too common. It seems as though whenever we go home, there is someone who suggests that Washington is broken. We hear it regularly. They use it to describe the current state of our federal government. Washington is now used in a derogatory manner. This city, the capital of our nation, named after our very first commander-in-chief, the man who led us to victory in the Revolutionary War and birthed this great nation, has become over time the same as a four-letter word. Remember, George Washington left the presidency voluntarily after 2 terms in office. He wanted to get away from the monarch style of government in which rulers held their positions for life. And now this city that bears his name is full of lifelong bureaucrats, and even worse, they are unaccountable to the people. It is a far cry from the republic our founders envisioned. Madam President, in the year 2026, our country will celebrate its 250th birthday. That is just over a decade away. When we get to that point, I hope to join my fellow Americans in looking back with great pride in all that we have accomplished and all that we have to pass on to future generations. President Kennedy challenged our nation to put a man on the moon before the decade of the 60s had passed. Less than 10 years. I'm not asking us to do anything as tough as putting a man back on the moon, but I think we should commit ourselves to removing the barrier of government regulations that is weighing on the American spirit and again set free the American economy before the decade preceding our 250th birthday. I have not just introduced legislation to start a new committee that exists in name and does no deed. Americans want us and expect us to be up to this challenge. And I believe that we can. We can lift the heavy hand of government. The Founding Fathers did not anticipate thousands of regulators and 1 million regulations when they created this country. It's time to end this regulation without representation and restore lawmaking process to the people. I thank my friends on both sides of the aisle who have co-sponsored Restore and encourage the rest of my colleagues to sign on to this common sense approach to addressing the issue of overregulation so we can work to make this country even greater and safer than we found it. Then, during our 250th birthday celebration, we can be proud that we restored a little South Dakota and American common sense for our children and their children. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
Madam President, let me say to our new colleague from South Dakota how much all of us enjoyed his first major speech, and also congratulate him on focusing on what I think is the single biggest problem confronting our country, creating the slow growth rate that we've had throughout the Obama presidency. So the senator from South Dakota has focused on the biggest drag on our economy, the single biggest thing holding this country back from reaching its potential. So I would say to my friend from South Dakota, you picked the perfect subject. And you've laid out a good solution to it. And I hope lots of colleagues on both sides of the aisle will rally around this excellent proposal as a good way forward to deal with the single biggest domestic problem we have, retarding the future growth of our country. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Dakota.
Madam President, I too want to congratulate my colleague from South Dakota, Senator Rounds, because he has already been a great leader on this subject as a successful 2-term governor, a leader in our state legislature. He was a practical, common sense, down-to-earth governor who just liked to get things done. And I think coming here to Washington, D.C. and finding the massive bureaucracy, in some cases dysfunction, that surrounds this city, it's very disillusioning, I think, at times to people across the country. And I think that the new senator from South Dakota is going to be a great voice, a clear voice on solutions for how to break through that. And he will. He'll be a great partner and someone that I look forward to continuing to work with. We worked together a lot during his time as governor and in the state legislature. but delighted that he's here in the United States Senate, where he can take the skills and the experience and just the passion he has to bring about positive change for our country and put it to work on behalf of the people of South Dakota and the people of our country. And I look forward to working with him on the very issue that he talked about today, because there's probably nothing right now that has a greater economic impact, creates more economic harm for the people that we represent in South Dakota than regulatory overreach, evidenced on an almost daily basis as new regulations emanate from various agencies across this town that make it more difficult, more expensive for people to create jobs, more difficult for farmers and ranchers and small business people to do the things that they do best, and just creates a higher burden, higher level of harm for people across the state, because everything that comes out of Washington, D.C. that drives up the cost of doing business in this country gets passed on to the consumers in our state and all across the country. So I congratulate the senator from South Dakota on his remarks, and am grateful for his great service to our state in so many ways already, and now adding to that here as a member of the United States Senate, where we have big problems, big challenges, but he meets that with not only big enthusiasm, but big experience when it comes to knocking down these barriers and making it more possible for people in this country to live more prosperous lives, safer lives, and hopefully more fulfilled lives when they can get government out of the way and allow their greatest aspirations to surface. So I hope we have the opportunity to deal with a lot of those issues and do it in a way that creates greater prosperity for people across South Dakota and across this country. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The senator from Oklahoma.
let me just observe here with all that he said and what his goals are. The senator from South Dakota sure chose the right committee. The committee that I chair, the Environment and Public Works Committee. That's what we talk about. That's what we do. And I had the honor of being in South Dakota before the election. As I walked around in South Dakota and looked around, I thought I could just as well be in Oklahoma. Up there, I talked to the Farm Bureau people from up there, and they said it's the regulations. That's a farm state. Oklahoma is a farm state, and we understand that. Of all the regulations they have and the problems that they have, they say that the EPA over-regulations are the greatest problem. Single one out are endangered species, single another one out, the waters of the United States. The waters of the United States, currently we're doing legislation. And it's legislation that is going to get that burden off of the people from South Dakota and Oklahoma. And right now we're considering the most expensive of all the regulations. That's the ozone regulations. It would constitute the greatest single increase in expenditures or taxes of anything in the history of this country. So it's nice to know that we have someone who's so committed to the goals of this committee to be singling this out in a maiden speech as his the greatest concern. And so I appreciate that as the chairman of that committee, and we're going to do wonderful things together for South Dakota, Oklahoma, and America. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.